The greatest director in the history of cinema has a name, and that name is Sergio Leone. Born and raised in Rome, Italy, the world of cinema was actually not Leone's original calling in life. His educational background was in law studies, and it seemed as though that was the trajectory his life would take. But after watching his father work on several film sets, Leone's passion for the craft of film began to take over. He would subsequently drop out of his law studies at university in order to pursue a career in film at the tender age of 18. From that moment, Leone would work on several film sets under many different roles, until the opportunity to direct fell right in the palm of his hand. During the production of a major Italian-produced picture, in which the original director had to step down for various reasons, Leone stepped up to the challenge, and in 1961, Leone would make his directorial debut with the sword and sandals epic, The Colossus of Rhodes. It was from this opportunity onwards that Leone would craft some of the most epic, innovative, genre-defining, technically refined masterpieces ever put to film. The Dollars Trilogy, Once Upon a Time in the West, Once Upon a Time in America. Every one of these epics featured an unmistakable, idiosyncratic style that was distinctly Leone's. The close-ups, the wides, the intense zooms, the sweeping landscapes, violence, lawlessness, the score by Ennio Morricone. It's sophisticated, yet brutal. Dark, yet also harmonious. Nothing can be left to interpretation. As soon as you see it, you know it's Leone's. Every movement, every detail, every frame. It is auteur filmmaking in its greatest and most distinctive form. A form of storytelling I like to refer to as controlled chaos. Think back to the last film that made you think. The film that presented an idea too graphic for the casual viewer to consume. Its taboos are dark and sinister. Its attitude cares not for the comfort of the audience. Nothing is left off of the table when it comes to how shocking the content is. The limit simply doesn't exist. But what distinguishes controlled chaos from just a regular hyper-violent production? Well, it's simple. The sophistication with which it is presented, the talent that is required to execute it perfectly. Violent enough to be shocking and impactful, yet made with enough skill to be considered brilliant. The technical brilliance delivered by a directorial genius in complete control of their craft. It's the cinematic equivalent to fine dining, yet the subject it covers is not for the squeamish. These are films like Oldboy, Cache, Antichrist, A Clockwork Orange, some of the greatest auteurs the world of cinema has to offer. Park Chan-wook, Mikhail Haneke, Lars von Trier, Stanley Kubrick. Making controlled chaos is a difficult balance, but when pulled off, it can emerge beautifully. It can create some of the greatest works cinema has to offer. A filmmaker like Kubrick, for example, is the quintessential example of controlled chaos at its finest. Kubrick's works are technically masterful, yet bold in the themes they tackle, often serving as commentary on the issues which haunt our society. His films are ones which laugh in the face of danger as they provoke controversy with whatever form of genre they decide to take. A Clockwork Orange, a dystopian crime film detailing the violent nature of humanity while also asking the question of whether or not society can control said violent instincts. Eyes Wide Shut, an erotic, psychological drama that dares to ask the question, what does the human psyche truly desire? Taking a deep dive into the conscience of the human soul. 2001: A Space Odyssey, a science fiction film tackling the subject of evolution, provoking questions involving the future of our species in the process. But when taking into consideration Kubrick's signature style, it can easily be compared to that of Leone's. The slow and methodical camera movements, the extreme attention to detail within every frame, the morally ambiguous characters and their encounters with violence. It doesn't take much to see how Leone can compete with the best of the best in directing. And when looking into how much influence Leone has over the genres he has tackled, specifically that of the Western, the claim for his greatness is supported even further. Let me take you on a trip down memory lane, a memory that might not be prevalent for the casual film viewer, but for the die-hard cinephile is a period in history which we would return to almost instantly if we could. Let me tell you about the age of the Western. stylish, exciting, cinematic, a pivotal time in American history, one which also happens to make for some of the most ambitious pieces of cinema ever put to film. Initially pioneered within the late 1800s, not long before the actual age of the frontiersman would perish, the genre would take on a life of its own within the next 3 decades and eventually would serve as the flagship genre for American cinema for the rest of the century. It's a tale as old as time. The average American man sets on a journey of merciless violence across a desert plain rampant with native conflict. Whether it is the story of an outlaw in his prime, riding with the posse he calls his brothers, or of the aging bounty hunter, struggling to come to terms with the fact that the world he once knew is becoming more and more of a stranger. There is no limit to whatever form the genre can take. Add on to the fact that its themes and style can be translated to other genres of the medium, such as the samurai or the crime epic, and you have a variation of cinema which truly is timeless. However, this was not the case by the time Leone entered the picture. By the time the early 60s arrived, American audiences became tired of the same old cliches, the same old style and tone, the same tone of optimism. The money machine that had kept the American studios afloat for the last quarter century had finally broken. Like a frontiersman wounded in the final shootout, it seemed as though the genre was limping on its last legs. But when the time came for Leone to dip his toes into the genre, he did something that would breathe new life into the genre while also sending shockwaves across the industry. He brought it to Italy. And in 1964, A Fistful of Dollars was released. Starring the then unknown American Clint Eastwood, the picture would be one of the first examples of an Italianized Western known overseas as the spaghetti Western. Think about everything that makes an American Western distinctive. Flashy gunfights, horse chases, sweeping music, heroes who were flawed in profession but who would always do the right thing in the end. The American outlaws became the saviors of the day. Justice would be restored. Now take each of those attributes and flip them over their heads. Instead of flashiness and style, the gunfights are gritty and unrelenting. Never shy away from depicting the real-life consequences of bloody violence. Instead of a sweeping and heartfelt score, the soundscape is intense and mischievous. And in the world of a spaghetti western, there are no good guys. Even the heroes are incredibly flawed in their actions. Whether influenced by personal profit or haunted by the tempting satisfaction of revenge, the anti-hero protagonist will do only what is necessary for themselves. You'll be lucky to see them try to help those around them in need. They might be the ones who emerge from the gunfights unscathed, but justice is far from served. They simply live on to fight another day. The spaghetti western depicted the American West in a much more realistic form than their mainstream counterparts. It was a stylish and exciting form of storytelling, but for completely different reasons, and the impact was felt almost immediately. While praised in its home nation of Italy, the mainstream American audience were appalled. Critiques of the genre came rushing forward, saying how sickening the violence was, that the films were executed in such poor taste. American audiences may have rejected their own brand of the Western, but the European derivative didn't offer much better in their eyes. After A Fistful of Dollars, Leone would make 2 sequels, For a Few Dollars More and the magnum opus, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But while the reception of this trilogy at the time was of poor quality, all 3 films have since gone down as classics of the medium, as some of the most epic and well-crafted stories ever put to film, with The Good, the Bad and the Ugly often being considered the greatest Western the genre has to offer. Leone didn't just add a new, visceral alternative to how the genre could be executed differently, he changed how the genre was perceived completely. To the point where now, this Italian breed of the Western genre is considered to be the genre in its greatest form. And what's more, Clint Eastwood, the man with no name, became a global sensation in his own right, further showing how much of an impact Leone's westerns have had on the industry as a whole. Leone crossed over like no other director before him. While other European directors struggled to translate their artsy, experimental formula to Western audiences, Leone seemed to do it seamlessly, by taking a genre that was already familiar to the US and deliver it with a flavour that was uniquely its own. And in 1968, Leone would make Once Upon a Time in the West, which would further demonstrate my point, as it too would go on to be mentioned in the same breath as the Dollars trilogy are some of the best the genre has to offer. What's more, Leone's slow, methodical and technically polished approach was on full display in this film. And honestly, a little too on display, if you ask me. I find Once Upon a Time in the West to be Leone's most overrated work. While it hasn't caused me to lose admiration for Leone's ability in the slightest, it's just too slow for my taste. Granted, it may just be because of the attention span that I have, but regardless, it certainly isn't my favourite of Leone's work. But the reason I say that is ironically the exact reason for its greatness. The slow, drawn-out sequences of outlaws scowling at each other menacingly, eventually reaching to the point of a barbaric climax. Leone proved with this work how much he has mastered the art of tension in cinema. But it is that same overly elongated suspense that may draw viewers away from the experience. But regardless, Leone truly achieved the impossible with his westerns. And that was not the only instance where Leone breathed new life into a dying genre. In 1984, after 13 years of inactivity, Leone returned to the silver screen with the gangster epic Once Upon a Time in America, Leone's magnum opus and one of my all-time favourite films. The visual style remains gritty in nature, yet grandiose in scale. The urban slums of a 1910s New York ring true for the roots of the Italian underbelly in America. It is in areas like these that the likes of real-life mafiosos of the period, such as Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, first settled into after migrating from the homeland. It is here where they launched their careers within organised crime, beginning as poverty-stricken street kids hustling for pennies and eventually working their way up the ranks, establishing their own organised chain of criminal activity. The Five Families of New York, the Commission, the National Crime Syndicate, establishments of power that were at the time too great for their own good. And it didn't just consist of Italians. Meyer Lansky, after all, was Jewish, acting as one of the founding fathers of the Jewish mob upon solidifying his team up with Luciano. The world was theirs. Both groups found considerable success when operating apart, but when united, they were untouchable. This empire first rose to prominence throughout the 1920s and 30s, and by the 60s and 70s became the most powerful entity within the criminal underworld. This is how the American Mafia was born. Now, why is this historical context so crucial to Once Upon a Time in America? Because that is exactly the story Leone tells in the film. Only replace Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky with David Noodles Aronson and Max Berkowitz, and make every single mobster in the gang Jewish, might I add, and you have an unofficial biopic detailing the rise to power of the mob. And what's more, if you thought Leone was showing off his technical pastiche with his spaghetti westerns, Once Upon a Time in America features twice as much of it. There are sequences, particularly within the first 30 minutes, that harken back to the silent era of Fritz Lang and F.W. Murnau. It is pure, symbolic, devoid of dialogue, visual storytelling in its most simplistic, yet somehow also its most multi-layered form. But while the film displays beauty in its execution, it too does not shy away from depicting some dark taboos within society. See, the thing that audiences must keep in mind, specifically with the gangster genre, is that these characters may be protagonists, but they are the furthest thing from being heroes. When people idolise Tony Montana, for example, due to his capitalist mentality of achieving the best possible results in life, attaining whatever you desire through hard work, no matter how large or over the top those ambitions may be, I look at those people and think, you do realise he had to kill people to get where he is, right? And also, you did see the end of the movie, right? Spoiler alert, he dies. But furthermore, the gangster archetype may be portrayed as somewhat of a figurehead for the poor working class, but the means of getting there are not something to be idolised in any shape or form. You make the decision to live a life of violence where you utilise brute force to obtain your means of living, then expect that nature to bite you back 10 times harder later down the line. And no one understands this better than Leone. See, there is a scene in Once Upon a Time in America where, without going into it with too much detail, Noodles, the lead played by Robert De Niro, rapes his love interest in the back seat of a cab. You understand my point now. Leone does everything in his power to make sure these people are portrayed as irredeemable monsters, which is why their downfall by the end of the picture becomes so satisfying. At the time of its release, the film makes something abundantly clear, that the gangster is much less of the entrepreneurial hero and more in league with the tortured psychopath, who is willing to get their way by any means necessary. With a skilled filmmaker behind the lens like Leone, controlled chaos has never arrived in better shape. The skill and craftsmanship behind it is the equivalent of a fine wine, yet what led to that wine are the grapes which had to be crushed to make it. But when thinking back to the title of the video, the greatest director of all time, there is not a shred of doubt that can be had over Leone's brilliance. Comparing him to someone like a Stanley Kubrick is definitely a comparison that can be justified when it comes to style. But to call Leone the greatest director of all time, especially next to Kubrick, who is largely considered to be the greatest of all time, how could someone justify that? Because sure, Leone's style of filmmaking is practically perfect. The films he has given us are some of the greatest of all time, but he has only made a specific number of films in his lifetime. When comparing his body of work to other greats like Scorsese or Spielberg, Leone is defeated when it comes to longevity in the industry. See, other great directors have been making films for decades, giving them the opportunity to get with the times per se, experimenting with the new technological advancements the industry has to offer over time while still making work which is unmistakably theirs. Just look at Scorsese's recent works. The Irishman and Killers of the Flower Moon went directly to streaming services, Netflix and Apple TV respectively. Two major platforms in a day and age where streaming services are becoming more and more of a dominant entity within the industry, while the experience of the cinema is slowly but surely becoming extinct. Even Scorsese, a legend of the game and a lifelong believer in the cinema experience, could not ignore this major changing of the guard. He too had to capitalise off of it in some way. But although this may go against the attitude of a filmmaking purist, it does on the other hand keep the classic names relevant within this day and age and allows for new opportunities to arise from their work the longer and longer they stay in the industry. But with the example of Leone, he was nowhere near on the level of his peers when it came to activity. He had an incredible run throughout the 60s, practically disappeared by the time the 70s came around, and made a brief comeback in the mid-80s. But as much of an incredible comeback as it was, it felt like the perfect final chapter to a career which promised so much, but in the end did not deliver as much as it could have. Leone simply did not have the mileage to develop or evolve his style. And that ultimately comes down to deciding on what would be better, changing your cinematic style over and over again to show your range and versatility, or to keep your style the same over the course of your career because it is just too incredible of a style to bother changing. Honestly, both arguments are valid. Both outcomes show greatness in different ways, but they show greatness nonetheless. But although Leone may not have the longevity that other directors in the GOAT conversation do, a strong argument remains in favour of Leone being deemed the greatest of all time. Why is this? Because Leone's style is perhaps the most cinematic form of storytelling you could ever envision as a film fan. Because like I said earlier in the video, every aspect of Leone's craft is in perfect form within every picture he makes. Let's look at the notorious B.I.G., who made only 2 albums across his short career, yet both albums are essentially perfect in every way. The lyricism, the storytelling, the production, the instrumentals, Biggie's flow and delivery, both Ready to Die and Life After Death are 2 of the greatest rap albums you could ever hope to hear. Yet for some reason, Biggie is often dismissed as the greatest rapper of all time, simply because his career has not had the longevity like other MCs such as Jay-Z, Nas or Eminem. But compare Biggie's only 2 albums, which are both perfect, to other great rappers who may have had several great albums across their career, but in the process also make a few which are either trash or just mediocre. Mileage has a price, and that price is that not every project you make is a masterpiece. Creativity is like money, it runs out at some point. So while the notorious B.I.G.'s career may have been cut tragically short, there is no denying the greatness at his peak overshadows perhaps every other rapper in existence. He is, after all, the rapper that I consider to be the GOAT, because of that exact reason. Quality of Biggie's records outshines the quantity of other discographies in hip-hop, and it is the exact same case with Leone.